Aseem, welcome back to the show. Great to see you.
Likewise, Megyn.
I love the time we had together before because it really takes something that's a very scary number to most people, which is that LDL score, and gives people a new way of thinking about it. You know, you can talk to your own cardiologist, but you are a cardiologist, and you were making some really interesting points about how we've been ruled by that number for too long, and we've been totally reliant on these statins for too long, irrespective of whether they cause side effects that can be very annoying to those taking them. So anyway, I'll get you the episode number, folks, so you can go back and take a look at that. But now Aseem is advising RFKJ and has got some thoughts on what's happening at HHS and where RFKJ is likely to take the public health industry. Already we've seen the need for him just this week in the news, the fact that the FDA's top dog left the FDA and went to Pfizer to be hired as their chief medical officer. This is exactly what RFKJ said he was going to try to tackle, this revolving door between Big Pharma and our public health agencies, which are obviously compromised. Your thoughts on it?
Yeah, Megyn, it's just a symptom of a system failure, really, these commercial distortions of health and healthcare. We had something similar in the UK last year. Jonathan Van Tam, who was a deputy chief medical officer, left his government position to get a lucrative job with Moderna. So it's almost things are happening in parallel. And, it's a real issue because we know that the interests of these big corporations, these drug companies, is not putting people first. It's about profit. It's profit through manipulation, profit through mass deception. We've seen the worst of the greatest failings of the system played out through the COVID pandemic, certainly with the rollout of the COVID vaccine. And it really just continues this sort of behavior, to be honest, and these sorts of actions just will undermine trust in our institutions and the medical establishment.
It's really amazing, and it's disgusting. I mean, this woman, she actually went to FDA from Pfizer, then goes to FDA overseeing public health and the drugs that are going to be fed to us, and then goes right back to Pfizer. I mean, whose interest is she actually serving in there?
Yeah, so, it's interesting because also people need to understand why or how this happens. One of the problems we have with, the approval of drugs or vaccines is that the so-called regulatory agencies that people believe to be independent are not. The FDA gets 65% of its funding from Big Pharma. So what that means is as well...
Wait, can you just say that again? Can you just say that again? I don't know if people understand that. Yeah.
The FDA and other regulators, like in the UK, the MHRA, get most of their funding from pharma. So the FDA gets 65% of its funding from Big Pharma. So it's in the interests, in a way you can understand, so the people working in the FDA who are approving the drugs, they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. But also, if they are friendly to industry, they potentially know that down the line they're going to get offered lucrative jobs with Big Pharma. Government jobs don't pay as well as these big corporations do. So it's a huge bias in the system, and it's damaging. It's very, very damaging.
And you use the right word. On that.
Disgusting.
What do you mean they get?
Megyn.
What do you mean they get 65% of their funding from Big Pharma? Like, what do you mean? Why isn't the federal government funding the FDA?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So I think things really started to, this is part of the economic system we're in, Megyn. So in the up until sort of the 80s, maybe early 90s, most of the funding of these regulatory agencies came from government. But because of the economic change, something called the neoliberalism that was the brainchild of a Chicago economist who was very close to Ronald Reagan, his name was Milton Friedman. He basically, wanted to reduce regulations, if you like, and allow companies to basically, have open season when it came to drug development, less regulation, etc. And government obviously thought it was better for them to reduce spending, not knowing what the consequences would be. I don't think this was deliberate. And over time, what would happen is the drug companies then took over funding the very industries that's supposed to regulate them because it suits their interests, doesn't it, of course, because then they get more drugs approved more quickly. And we're now in a situation where we're having to deal with a massive over-medicated population around the world in the United States. It's estimated globally, I've said this before, but people need to hear it again, that the third most common cause of death after heart disease and cancer globally is prescribed medications. This is not even to do with the COVID vaccine or other vaccines. This is pre-pandemic figures. And this is just one symptom of why we've got here, really, Megyn.
This is all connected.
It's unacceptable.
We've been discussing, right? The way we eat, the toxins that we ingest on a daily basis, the way we poison ourselves with virtually everything that's all around us, and then a public health system that gets rich off of chronic illness, and federal regulators who are supposed to be looking out for us, who actually are on the take to Big Pharma and industries like that, more interested in padding their own pockets than they are potentially in helping the rest of us, or at least that's how it looks. I mean, I don't know this Patrizia Cavazzoni, but she was the director of the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. From 2020 through this past January. She resigned just ahead of Trump returning to office. And now where does she go? Chief Medical Officer at Pfizer.
Well, it's interesting, Megyn, because I didn't know that. And that, for me, suggests that she had a big role to play in the approval of the COVID vaccine, which we know has been an absolute horror, right? If you look at the evidence now, if you allow me to elaborate a little bit on that, I mean, things keep accumulating over time. When the COVID vaccine was approved, let's say Pfizer and Moderna, which was the most prominent COVID vaccines used in the United States, we were under this impression, and it was obviously fueled by, all sorts of media, especially the legacy media, that it was going to be very protective, maybe 95 to 100% protective against infection, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that all, ultimately proved to be false. But when the original trials were reanalyzed by independent scientists, and this was then published in the peer-reviewed journal Vaccine, which is the highest impact medical journal for vaccines. What they found is that from the very beginning, Megyn, you were more likely to suffer serious harm from the COVID vaccine, mRNA vaccines, than you were to be hospitalized with COVID. And that serious harm rate in the trial was only a short-term harm, because I want to come on to the long-term harms in a second. And that was a rate of about 1 in 800, right? So if you think, and that's on the most rigorous data, that's their own original trials where everything is supposed to be equal in terms of the participants who are in the placebo group, who don't get the vaccine, the ones that get the vaccine, same background, same age, etc. But when these trials are designed, and they were designed by the drug companies, so this is another problem. They design the trials, they control the data, they then give summary results to the regulator then approves them. But of course, it's in the interest of the regulator to approve them if they're getting funding from Big Pharma. So it's a complete mess. That's just short-term harms. And then there was an interesting survey done in the United States, which was published in one of the major medical journals. I must say, though, later retracted, not because of error, but because of pressure, because of the media frenzy that happened as a result of it. They did a survey in the United States that revealed, according to 57% of people surveyed, felt that they knew somebody, either they'd been severely injured or they knew someone that had died or been severely injured from the vaccine. They extrapolated from that and estimated there may have been, in the first year of the COVID vaccine in the United States alone, Megyn, 280,000 deaths and 1 million serious adverse events. Now, given the other data we know from around the world, there was a publication, the BMJ, by Dutch researchers, which suggested the COVID vaccines have contributed to 2 million excess deaths globally. This is pretty horrific stuff. And only last week, you may be aware, Yale researchers published new research that showed a long-term effect problem from the vaccine, which is that people who had what we call post-vaccine syndrome or long COVID symptoms like fatigue and brain fog, for example, 2 years after having the vaccine, Megyn, they found in this particular group, they didn't look at other groups, that there was still circulating spike protein in the body, which essentially can be causing damage to the tissues or causing an autoimmune reaction. I personally, Megyn, and I was pretty okay after the initial vaccine, about a year and a half after the vaccine, I developed psoriasis, an autoimmune condition linked to that depression, and I wasn't sure what was going on. And there's a brilliant doctor in Malibu, a very well-known established gastroenterologist called Sabine Hazan, and she did some published research, which is pretty extraordinary and a bit scary, but we need to talk about it, is that she found that 3 years after taking the COVID vaccine, a very important bacteria in the gut called bifidobacteria, it's a very important part of the gut microbiome, it's a good bacteria, after 3 years went down to zero. Now, why that's important is that bacteria is very important for health. It's important for producing neurotransmitters like serotonin. So a lot of people might be suffering from anxiety, depression because of a vaccine they had 2 or 3 years ago. It triggered, I almost certainly, she called me up and said, Aseem, you have the exact signature of someone who's vaccine injured because your bifid is zero. And I've had this resistant problem for now, coming up to a year and a half. I've still got depression. It's mild, but it's still debilitating at times. And I see other doctors I speak to are saying they're seeing an explosion of autoimmune conditions. Megyn, if you don't mind me asking, I remember you mentioned the fact that you had some issue that you think was vaccine related that caused an autoimmune issue with you as well.
Yeah, that I tested positive for an autoimmune condition, though it was undiagnosed or unspecified which one.
Right. Okay. So, and in your mind, do you feel it may have been linked from, with everything you know about your health?
I asked the rheumatologist. I said, do you think this could be linked to the fact that I got double shotted by COVID, by Pfizer. I had both of the vaccines, and then I got one booster. And in New York, you couldn't travel. You couldn't do anything unless you proved. It was just ridiculous. I wish I hadn't done it, but I did. So I got that first booster and third shot total. And within a month, I got COVID. It was right when the Omicron version started to circulate. So within a month, I both had the booster and then COVID. And then I had my annual physical and it showed up. And I then got sent to a rheumatologist. And I asked her, do you think this, because it was unspecified. It was like, which one? They tested for a few specific autoimmunes. It didn't like register one versus another. And I said, do you think this could be because of what just happened with getting the booster and then getting COVID within a month? And she said, yes, I do. And you're not the only patient I have seen have this exact sequence of events.
Yeah. So I think this is, something I'm seeing with lots of patients. There's more and more reports coming out. And I think, what really needs to happen, Megyn, now, there needs to be a moratorium on this COVID vaccine globally. Certainly I know, and I'm sure you've read this, that, people who are in prominent positions, certainly within the new Trump administration, I know they've already expressed concerns historically about the COVID vaccines. We don't need to name them. We all know who they are. But I think the one thing that still needs to happen, and I've got to be honest, I think, President Trump is a remarkable man in the way that he has come back. He's so resilient. He's exactly the disruptor we need right now to really change the system for the good. And he's made some really important comments about making sure big pharma companies are accountable. I don't think yet he's on the same page, and probably because he doesn't have the full information around the COVID vaccine. One of the things that keeps getting perpetuated in the media is this, and I'll explain why this is completely false, that the COVID vaccine has saved tens of millions or millions of lives. And the data on which that information is based, Megyn, is not even, it's the lowest level quality of evidence. It's not even considered in the hierarchy of evidence-based medicine, to the extent where one of the leading figures in the world in evidence-based medicine, a guy called Carl Hennigan at the Center of Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford, wrote an article saying that this claim is implausible. Not just him. In the United States, you have the most cited medical researcher in the world. His name's Professor John Ioannidis from Stanford. I call him the Stephen Hawking of medicine. A couple of years ago, he wrote an article in one of the peer-reviewed journals saying that non-randomized studies, so studies which aren't the one which I described earlier with the 1 in 800 figure of harm, he says that claims of them being, so beneficial or preventing deaths from COVID, et cetera, may be spurious. In other words, fake. So, we need to really put this to bed. And I think if anybody, we need to have this conversation so that President Trump, and I think he's up for turning, because I think he was deceived, he was misled by these drug companies. We need to get to a situation where he comes out and says, listen, you know what, we did this with the best of intentions. And it's true, we may have saved, some lives, certainly in the high-risk people. But overall now, the fact that it was given to so many other people at low risk, it's very clear, Megyn, for me, it's very, very clear with the evidence that we've done more harm than good here, and it needs to stop. And the reason we need to stop
about now, let me ask you this, Aseem. And by the way, before I forget, the earlier episode with Aseem was episode 964. Right about now, a lot of viewers are having the water rising right here. Like they're starting to get very stressed out because virtually everybody got the vaccine. And we have seen, who among us has not seen a sudden death by a loved one, a friend, somebody else's friend, et cetera, over the past few years and wondered, is it related to that vaccine? And they will never say it was the vaccine. Just nobody says that. But it's like, okay, young, otherwise healthy people are dropping dead, and you both worry for those you love and you worry for yourself. I mean, I talk to people who are going down to Mexico and getting all their blood replaced. I'm like, well, how could that possibly work when you've altered your genes? If you've altered your genes, replacing all your blood with new blood is not going to change it. And your own body, I think, replaces your blood anyway over the course of time. Anyway, is there anything you can say to make them feel better about their prospects right now?
Well, listen, I think we have to, confront an uncomfortable truth, Megyn. Let's be honest first and foremost. But one of the things why we need to get this stopped and pulled and we need the president involved is because, it's going to give us more information of what we need to do to sort this out, identify who's at risk so people don't worry unnecessarily, identify who may be at risk of a further problem, and then we can use the best minds of science and medicine to actually allow research to take place to find the solution, Megyn. That's another issue. It's not just like, people said to me, Dr. Malhotra, listen, it's happened. People don't know about it. I said, no, this is going to be an ongoing issue. And we need to talk about it right now so that we can stop problems in the future. One of the things I do, for example, is I see many patients who are vaccine injured. One of the definite things they can do, certainly which will help, which is exactly what, Make America Healthy Again is about, is optimize their health when it comes to diet, when it comes to exercise, when it comes to reducing stress, because all these things are additional factors that make you more likely to suffer from these vaccine injuries. One of the other issues that's emerged as well, unfortunately, is that, and it's interesting, you said it's not unusual that you got COVID about a month after having the booster or the second dose, because we now know, and it sounds crazy to say it, and it's not just me. I had an email exchange with one of the world's top immunologists. His name is Robert Clancy in Australia, and he just thinks it's mind-boggling for him that this is still being used. It causes immunosuppression. We have one of the world's top oncologists, Angus Dalgleish in the UK, who is actually behind, identifying the CD4 cells being involved in AIDS and HIV. Right, he's a very eminent guy. He's an oncologist and an immunologist, and he's saying that it causes immunosuppression, and especially people who've had boosters are more vulnerable to getting cancer. I've had people who I know, friends of, my friends, younger brothers, etc., developing cancer, and it's just, and as a doctor, intuitively something isn't right, and we have the data suggesting that the COVID vaccine has a mechanism where it can do this. Now, I'm not saying this is for everybody, and I think it's still going to be in a minority, but the problem is we're now in a situation, and I am also equally anxious, having thought I was probably okay. And as you know, my father died as a result of the COVID vaccine, almost certainly had a sudden cardiac death 6 months after having 2 doses of Pfizer. Is that we're now in this uncertain phase where can problems develop in 3 or 4 or 5 years' times that at the moment we're basically ticking bombs. I don't like to use these words lightly, but I don't want to exaggerate the fear, but we need to really have this conversation, not be afraid to say we are concerned. And
no, there's been no accountability. That's the thing. Like,
not at all.
I remember saying on this program, if something goes very wrong with the vaccine, these drug companies are going to have to fix it, because look at the number of people who are taking the vaccine. There's no way they'll be able to just allow millions of people to be vaccine injured and move forward. And I've never been more wrong about anything. That is the number one thing I have been wrong about. They've moved on. I mean, Steve Krakauer, my EP, was just saying in my ear, we couldn't have even had this conversation 3 years ago. I mean, as it is, YouTube's probably going to slap a bunch of warnings on this discussion. Fine, nobody reads your warnings, YouTube. But even to get this video to live 3 years ago would have been very hard for us. And so it's like the mere fact that you're allowed to raise these questions and say these things is real progress. But we're far, far, far from Pfizer having to look at us and say, here's what we're doing about it.
Yeah, no, of course. And actually their model, in fact, is probably, and this is how business is done, make money from both sides, is that they are now going to, they've invested heavily in cancer drugs for turbo cancers, which are also one of the potential adverse effects of this COVID vaccine. So, and that's why the definition, and this is important for people to understand, we have, these big corporations who've got more power than ever. They've become the dominant force in our society, more economic power than many governments, okay, almost tyrannical to a large degree. And the way to describe them as legal entities in the way they make money has been defined by the preeminent expert Robert Hare, psychologist, as actually fulfilling the criteria for psychopathy. Callous unconcern for the safety of others, incapacity to experience guilt, repeated lying and conning others for profit. And this is something that I've seen and been very much aware of pre-pandemic. Of course, I had a blind spot on the COVID vaccine, as I had for all vaccines, Megyn, because I took 2 doses myself. But with all the other drugs in the system, I knew that this is exactly how it worked. And of course, you see this confluence of interest with like big food. People talk about, big food essentially drive the chronic disease, and then big pharma give us drugs, which, by the way, in general are pretty useless. That's another conversation that needs to be had when we talk about making America healthy again. And this is absolute fact. Most drugs, a large proportion from most of the health expenditure in the US comes from prescription drugs for chronic disease management. Chronic disease management are things like heart disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, for example, so-called high cholesterol we talked about already. Most people taking those drugs are not going to get any benefit, because this is another, shift in the paradigm, in the conversations that happens between doctors and patients. We talked about statins, for example, that the benefit at best from taking a statin and preventing a heart attack, people who have not already had a heart attack, which is most people taking statins, is 1%, 1 in 100. Patients are not told that. They're not given informed choice, but they're all then exposed to side effects. But the good news is, Megyn, once this information becomes freely available and these conversations start happening, we could very quickly improve the system. We can get a more efficient healthcare system. We can reduce costs and improve quality as well at the same time.
Okay, but here's the frustrating thing as a consumer or a patient is, even I wouldn't say I'm anywhere near as like immersed in information as the full MAHA team is, but I mean, I've done a fair amount of interviews with people like you who are very smart on these issues, and I remain confused. Like, for example, on the cholesterol issue, you and I we talked about the LDLs and how they may not be the scary thing that your cardiologist or your doctor will tell you they are, and that, in fact, as you made the point that a higher LDL actually could have a protective effect for older people when it comes to other illnesses, and didn't think much of statins and so on. And then I read Good Energy by Casey Means, who I love and respect and think she's amazing. She's not a cardiologist, but she is a doctor. And she's like, got to keep the LDLs down, right? So it's like, it's like well-meaning people like me are like, I don't know what to do. And you're talking about, your heart health and a potential heart attack. So you don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah, no, I get that. And to be fair to Casey as well, I mean, I'm in a very unique position when it comes to the cholesterol discussion, because I'm not blowing my own trumpet here. As an independent doctor, as a cardiologist that doesn't have any link to industry, I've probably done more research and publications and deep dive and understanding of this cholesterol and statin issue than anyone in the world. And the reality is that once you correct for what we call triglycerides and HDL, parts of the cholesterol profile, essentially links to excess body fat and insulin resistance, driven by ultra-processed food, there is no relationship with LDL cholesterol and development of heart disease. That data was actually already available years ago. At the end of the late 90s, the co-director of the Framingham study, which is where cholesterol emerges as a so-called risk factor for heart disease, said that if your LDL cholesterol essentially, was below, as an independent risk factor, did not become apparent as a risk factor for heart disease unless it was at least above 250 or 300. Most, 99% of people, Megyn, don't have LDL cholesterol that high. And then we did further research in this group of people that have got a very high LDL genetically called familial hyperlipidemia. That affects 1 in 250 people. Let's just look at those. And this is published in BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine, peer reviewed. People can look this up, me and a number of scientists. And we found that in people with very, very high levels of LDL cholesterol, above 300, for example, there was no difference in the ones that develop heart disease in their LDL levels and the ones that did develop heart disease. And therefore, that is another nail in the coffin to this LDL theory hypothesis that it causes heart disease. It's basically I would say it's $1 trillion industry. It's $1 trillion scam. The statin benefit that I mentioned, 1%, is there from the trials. Having said that, another caveat, again, Megyn, which is what we need to do and change the system with MAHA, is that these drug trials have never been independently evaluated. So we have to trust drug companies. But let's just say it is true that it's 1% benefit, okay? That's because statins have an independent effect where they are slightly anti-clotting and anti-inflammatory. And heart disease is an inflammatory condition linked to abnormal clotting and insulin resistance. when you look at all the other drugs that lower in cholesterol or diet, just lowering LDL cholesterol, again, I was involved in this research published in BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine. We looked at this and we found no relationship. So lowering cholesterol per se does not prevent heart attacks or stroke. This is an absolute,
Okay, so like, what does? What does?
What does? Okay, all right. So the main driver of heart disease, the number one sort of risk factor is insulin resistance, which basically is linked to 5 markers. And that's why I set up this program called Metabolic Health, which is very easy to measure, very simple. Most doctors aren't having these conversations with patients, which is basically looking at 2 markers of your cholesterol profile, triglycerides and HDL, so-called good cholesterol, your waist circumference, Megyn, whether you have a high blood pressure or what we call pre-high blood pressure, pre-hypertension, or whether you're pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic. Now, 1 in 3 adult Americans are type 2 diabetic, and 93% of American adults now have suboptimal metabolic health, okay? The good news, Megyn, is this. You can optimize this within weeks of just changing diet, cutting out the ultra-processed food, minimizing the sugar and the starches from your diet, and basically reset. That's what we call a metabolic reset.
That's listen to what he just said. What he just said, because I still have heard from my cardiologist, stop eating so much red meat. Stop eating so much red meat. And you didn't even mention red meat. You're talking about ultra-processed foods, sugar, and starchy carbs.
Absolutely. There is no relationship with the consumption of red meat. The most extensive studies have been done, looked in their totality, red meat and heart disease. Red meat, I'm not saying it's protective, but it's a very nutritious food. I tell my cardiac patients, these are cardiac patients who have heart attacks. I tell them, listen, cut the ultra-processed foods, follow the best components of the Mediterranean diet, extra virgin olive oil, oily fish, whole fruit and vegetables, but I'm not worried about how many steaks you eat a week. I'll tell you something interesting. Only yesterday, I had a consultation with a patient. This is a great story, Megyn. I'm glad I'm going to share this with you for the first time. This is a guy that saw me almost 10 years ago. He comes for a follow-up. At the age of 62, he was diagnosed with severe blockages in all of his heart arteries. He was recommended to have a coronary artery bypass surgery. Okay. And essentially told that unless he had it, he's probably going to die within a very short space of time, within a few years. Now, he came to me and he said, listen, doctor, I don't want to go under the knife. I want to try alternatives. This is my personal preference. I really don't want to have surgery. Luckily, at that point, his symptoms were quite mild, but he had those blockages diagnosed. And he said, is there anything else I can do? I've read your work. Can I go on a diet plan? Can I do a lifestyle change? And I gave him that plan. Exactly that. I told him, I went through his diet and he was a CEO of a company, if I remember correctly. He was spending 8 hours of the day in a car. He was sedentary. He was eating snack foods and sweets all the time. So there's lots of room for improvement. He completely changed his diet. I also found out he was very stressed. So, I advised him to do breath work, meditation. He also was, thinking about coming towards retirement early because of his, his heart issue. And he was, wealthy enough to be able to do that. So he contacts me. Only yesterday I had a consultation with him, and I presumed when he got back in touch with me that he'd done this for a while, but ultimately needed a bypass, and he was going to come to me and say, listen, I had the bypass and I just want to check in with you and see how things are going, et cetera, and anything else I can do. Megyn, he didn't have the bypass. He now, grows his own vegetables. He cooks, completely transformed his life. He swims 3 times a week. He walks his dog 5 miles a day. He's got no symptoms. And this is 9 years after being told essentially he could probably die if he didn't have a bypass operation. That is the power of lifestyle change. And by the way, the other thing to say, this was without a statin. He got side effects from the statin and stopped his statin. That was the other part of the discussion. He's not taking a statin and hasn't taken a statin for 9 years.
How does the calcium score play in?
Okay, the calcium score is a really good, useful, validated test that is simple to do, a little bit of radiation through CT scan, takes 5 minutes, non-invasive. And what it does is it tells you the buildup of what we call coronary calcium, nothing to do with diet, by the way, nothing to do with blood calcium. The calcium is basically deposited where there is inflammation and where blockages tend to occur. And you can get a score anything from 0, which is completely normal, to well over 1,000, which indicates there is a lot of furring of the arteries. But what's useful about the calcium score, Megyn, as well, is it actually gives you a very accurate prediction, more than cholesterol. Blood cholesterol we know is essentially useless, but more than other factors, it gives you a prediction of your risk of a heart attack or stroke in the next 10 years. So I use it quite often in patients that have been scared by their doctor saying you're going to die because your cholesterol's high unless you take a statin. We do the calcium score on them, Megyn, And of course, a lot of cholesterol, that the so-called LDL is, 80% of it essentially is genetic. Okay. You're born with it. So if they come to me in their middle age, if their LDL cholesterol has been a problem for them, they're going to have significant heart disease. Do the calcium score, 0.
Wow. That's an
so
important
I can
test.
reassure them that they don't need to worry about their cholesterol, essentially.
Peter Attia likes that one too. He likes the calcium score, just as sort of a baseline of where you are. So this is also fascinating. This is I'm so thrilled that RFKJ got in there and is going to be looking into things like this. I mean, already, yesterday there was an EO on transparency on drug costs. Already he's taking a look at interesting things. And he stopped, what was the thing that he stopped yesterday? He stopped something. It was a testing program that was going on for the oral COVID vaccine. He was like, we're not stopping it forever, but we're pausing that. I'm not sure that's the best use of our resources. So already he's in there questioning, you might say, questioning. So as somebody who knows him and has worked closely with him, what do you think are going to be the top items we'll see over, let's say, the first 100 days or so?
Well, listen, I think, and if everybody can look this up, because I was, there's a brilliant executive order from the president, obviously with Robert Kennedy Jr.'s input, on the MAHA plan. And Megyn, it's absolutely extraordinary. It's so comprehensive. They've covered essentially everything. So they're going to look at, all of the existing data when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to environmental influences on health. They've set up a commission. This was what heartened me the most, to look at how different sectors of our lives, whether it's housing, education, income, how that impacts on your health. And why that's really important, Megyn. This is a conversation that needs to be had in America and across the world. We need to go back to square one to understand what are the building blocks of a healthy society? What does it mean to be healthy? And one of the things that hasn't been discussed enough or ignored, if you like, is that, if you look at, I'll give you some figures here. Okay, in the United States and even in the UK, it's not dissimilar. The gap in life expectancy between the richest and poorest is about 10 years on average, right? It's huge, okay? Healthy life expectancy difference is about 20 years. When you look at the data, about 80% of that difference can be explained by what we call the social determinants of health, or the wider determinants of what it means to be healthy. So and this basically means having, an income that allows you to lead a healthy life, good quality housing. A lot of people are suffering in the United States because, they may be certainly through the winter, they don't have adequate heating, access to education. If you are in a job, Megyn, that is high demand, low control, low pay, you're on the minimum wage, which I understand in the US, certainly pre-pandemic, was about $7.25, then that can be more damaging to health. The stress associated with being in those sorts of conditions, Megyn, can be more damaging to health than being unemployed. Okay.
Wow.
And what's the mechanism? The underlying mechanism is severe chronic stress. So if you have chronic stress over your lifespan, if you're, for example, brought up in a family, if you're a child that is, in a deprived family, or you're a victim of severe psychological abuse or emotional abuse, that starts to already have an effect on the disease process that will cut your life short later down the line. These are the conversations we need to start having. So that's why what's really fascinating is it's about health through all sectors. So we need to look at the Department of Education, housing, et cetera, and say those departments, those, agencies, if you like, they need to be having health at the forefront. There was something I was reading really interestingly recently, is that Thomas Jefferson in 1809, in an address to Republicans in Washington, said, the care of health and human happiness, and not its destruction, is the first and most important object of good government. That's Thomas Jefferson, right? For me, it's not about big government or small government. It's about good government, because ultimately the politicians have the control over laws to ensure that we create conditions so that everybody, Megyn, who's going to disagree with that, has the best opportunity to lead the best life they can in terms of their health. And this isn't just about people who are not well off. During the pandemic, Megyn, Boris Johnson, our prime minister, I commented on this. He got hospitalized with COVID, and I said it's likely because of his weight. I said it in a compassionate way. He was after he came out. I didn't say it when he was in hospital. And, that became a big story because he was, and he admitted it, obese. And this is a guy who's got agency. He's got wealth. Right? And this tells us that all of us really are in this because we're affected by this ultra-processed food environment. We've been misled about information about cholesterol, about what's a healthy diet. So I think all of this is going to be uncovered under Trump's administration, under the leadership, certainly on health, of Robert Kennedy Jr.
That's so encouraging. Just even back when I was in school, I can't even remember whether it was high school or college right now, but we learned about a study that had been done on two groups of monkeys. And it was that, I think it was monkeys. It might have been a different primate, but it was that there were two different cages of them, and they like a dominant monkey. Like the order works best when there's one dominant. And what they did was they put two dominant in one cage and just the one dominant in the second cage. And the monkeys got exactly the same food, exactly the same lifestyle. Nothing else was different other than the one cage of monkeys was very stressed out and the other wasn't. And then many years later, when they died of totally natural causes, they were dissected and they looked at their arteries, and the arteries of the monkeys that had been in the stressed out cage were completely, they were clogged. They were not the picture of health, versus the other monkeys, which didn't have anywhere near that level of fatty buildup on the walls of the arteries and so on. And the only difference between the monkeys was the stress. So it's like you look at these people who focus so much, some obsess over what they eat and the amount of exercise and, don't have this and don't have that. And they totally forget being stressed out all the time may be the worst health factor in your life. It must be addressed.
Megyn, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and that's the elephant in the room. I think everything that underpins what's really driving at the root of the problem is the chronic stress. And it comes down to how we live, how we interact with each other as well. We know that one of the biggest predictors, I know you're talking to Brian Johnson later, but one of the predictors of longevity and happiness, actually the quality of our relationships, having someone to love and someone that loves you. That it sounds very basic, but it's so important. And that mitigates also from the external stresses of life, which are inevitable. So all these conversations need to be had. And of course, it also applies to, a child being nurtured by their mother. I think I always tell people the most important relationship you're going to have in your life, I think, is the one between mother and child. How you're brought up and being allowed to create the conditions so that moms can be there for their children so they can have a nurturing upbringing, rather than being a single mom, for example, working two jobs, trying to make two ends meet in an unjust system where they're not getting paid enough, where big corporations exploit their workers, where you've got a pay differential between the CEO of a company and the production worker of 326 times, which I think is a figure now, which is extraordinary. So we have to have a conversation as a society saying, is this actually fair and just? And then you add in, Megyn, on top of that, I'm all for meritocracy when people are earning their money doing the right thing. But a lot of these big corporations have made their money through mass deception, right? You look at Big Pharma, for example, and then they don't pay their taxes. And then the government have less money to spend on public services, which are being degraded and undermined. So we have to link it all together. The CEO of Pfizer made,
I think, $30 million last year. That was his take-home pay, which I think is one of the reasons why. Just Pfizer in general and these vaccine companies, we're all very skeptical of them now. Not all, but many of us are very skeptical because we don't feel like we've been given the truth. There was an extraordinary moment where he showed up at the Trump White House on Black History Month on the celebration. And Trump, who, he is still pro-vaccine, and he introduced him like, yay, CEO of Pfizer. And the community wasn't having it. Somebody on Twitter pointed out, or X, Trump led a populist movement, but he doesn't control the populace. They still have their own feelings on certain issues, and Pfizer and the vaccines are one of them. Look at this.
We also have the head of Pfizer here, so I want to thank him. One of the great people, one of the great businessmen. Thank you, Albert. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Trump gets it. He knew, but his most loyal followers were not having it.
Yeah, I think two things to mention there, Megyn. Absolutely. I don't think a single American voted for President Trump the second term because of Operation Warp Speed and the COVID vaccine. I'm pretty sure that didn't happen, right? And the second thing is, he's got a great sense of humor and he's a very shrewd man. And if you look at the reaction there, I think that was almost reinforcing what he probably already deep down knows.
Yep, I think that's
right. This COVID vaccine is a mess.
I wanted to round back to a question about the vaccine because Cheryl Atkinson, a former CBS News journalist, she has a podcast and a show also, and she previewed an interview she's going to be doing on March 2nd with a doctor whose name is Dr. Ryan Cole, who is sounding the alarm on some of the effects of the COVID vaccine. And the following soundbite grabbed my interest. Take a listen here. It was just published today on her podcast feed.
What did you start to see when the vaccine rolled out in pathology?
Well, that's when I started getting reports from colleagues about clots all over the body and people dropping from pulmonary emboli. I have colleagues in the military talking about young, healthy, active soldiers ending up in the hospital with horrendous clots, sudden death from clots, strokes in young patients from clots. And then some of the embalmers started reaching out to me and showing what they were seeing on embalming, which were these long fibrous clots that are obviously rare prior to the rollout of these shots.
That's extremely creepy and disturbing, but not. I believe him. I mean, a good friend of mine who's in public health, who's a lefty, was saying, Meg, we're hearing a lot about these clots and the embalmers. And she's like a pro, she was definitely pro-vaccine and the whole bit. And even she was like, I'm not taking any more. I'm hearing more about these. And now you hear this guy say it out. I mean, what are we supposed to do? If our blood is getting clotty, what do we do? Drink more water? Have an aspirin?
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah. So a couple of things, Megyn. First of all, I know Ryan very well, and he's a pathologist. He's a brilliant scientist. He has high integrity. We've spoken at conferences together. Solid guy. One of the top vascular surgeons in the world is a friend of mine in Ireland called Professor Sheriff Sultan. I talked to him about this as well. I mean, these sort of long fibrous clots have been known prior, but he also feels that they seem to have increased, and he's seen more problems. Certainly, he feels that there's been a massive issue with the COVID mRNA vaccine. He feels it should be suspended as well, and he's one of the top vascular surgeons in the world. So there's a lot more doctors speaking out about it. In terms of what people can do, I think with these particular fibrous clots, Megyn, as far as I've seen in terms of data and my own clinical experience, they tend to be stuff that develops relatively early on. So these are the kind of things that you see when people have either had a booster within a few weeks, maybe a month or so after, but usually within a short time frame. There was a separate study which looked at people that died within, I think, 2 or 3 weeks of having the COVID vaccine. And I think they found from autopsy studies, 74% was the figure roughly. They could actually directly say was caused by the COVID vaccine. But yes, what can we do? Again, it comes back to metabolic health. A lot of these problems are cardiovascular. I talked about insulin resistance earlier. And interestingly, it isn't just about heart disease. After smoking, it's the second biggest driver of cancer. So if we have this, mechanism in place to educate people and introduce, environmental policies, let's put it that way, to create a healthier food environment, food environment, food that's affordable, then you very quickly will see people optimize their metabolic health and improve it across the United States. And we will see, I think one of the aims of the new administration and Bobby in particular is to show demonstrable data of improvement within 2 years. That is absolutely doable.
That's one of the protocols for preventing dementia too. It's like, okay, you may have the gene, whatever, but if you minimize the number of toxins in your life, you're giving yourself at least the best chance possible of avoiding it. That's what RFK has been saying about vaccines and autism, that he can't prove a direct causal relationship, but that it may be one of several toxins that overwhelm the system in young children. And like the more of those that you can remove, not necessarily making a judgment on the vaccines for anybody, but the more toxins you can remove from your child's diet, the better. This is the road we're on. Final thoughts on whether we'll get there.
Thanks, Megyn. Yeah, so I mean, very quickly on that. Yes, you're right about dementia. Some people describe that, Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes. So same process. So 100% this is the way forward. I have a lot of hope. I think we've got the right people in place. We've got brilliant men like Jay Bhattacharya, who's almost certainly going to be, I think, the next director of the NIH. We've got, Marty McCarry. We've got Mehmet Oz. We've got Bobby in there. Anything I can do to help to facilitate it. And I think President Trump will listen.
And maybe you too. Hopefully you will be elevated to one of the top teammates. It would be great to see you there, Dr. Aseem Malhotra. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Megyn.
God, it's one of the privileges of this job to be able to talk to people like that. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I know it's scary, but we have to talk about it. And then, by the way, for what it's worth, that Dr. Cole on Cheryl's podcast did say drinking more water is beneficial on the clotting front. Go to metabolicreset.co for more from Dr. Aseem.